Welcome. It's 3:05 on Friday afternoon. How are you all still awake? Wow, you're easily kept awake, clearly. My name's Jonathan. This is Steve. We work for a consultancy called Zulka. We have an office in the UK. It's just down the road in Old Street. And if you were about to fall asleep, then we are here to give you nightmares. This is So You Can Sleep at Night, Ethics in Software Engineering. And we'd like to start with a quiz. So let me introduce my glamorous quiz show host, Steve Freeman.
Yes. Right. Haven't been called glamorous in a long time. Does anybody know who this is? It's unlikely, but just in case. This is Thomas Midgley Jr. As you can see, he's a very important person. An American chemist, won lots and lots of prizes. President of the American Chemical Society, as you can see, through the 20s to 40s, 200 degrees, member of the, lots and lots of stuff. Does anybody know what his first claim to fame was? It's slightly obscure, except that he invented leaded petrol, which turned out to be a bit of a disaster. In fact, they knew it was a bit of or they should have known it was a bit of a disaster, because quite a few people died during the development of the process. It's been, shortened lives, possibly increased violence in society, all kinds of bad things. In fact, in 1924, he gave a demonstration about how safe this stuff was by pouring leaded petrol over his hands. But later off, he had to take leave of absence from work because of lead poisoning. Okay, well, we eventually recovered from that. So when he'd done all that, he then went on to invent something else, CFCs. There were good reasons for this, because refrigerants at the time were very dangerous, actually. They were both flammable and toxic. So they wanted a safe, odorless refrigerant that was chemically inert, and they came up with the one that they came up with called Freon. And then eventually, as we discovered later, it turned out to be responsible for a hole in the ozone layer. And there's this wonderful quote from an academic, so that Thomas Midgley Jr. had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. But I think there's an interesting question here, is did Thomas Midgley Jr. actually, was he a bad person? Did he intend to poison the world? And I suspect not. I suspect he thought he was doing the right thing. And there's this, actually, there are a few quotes from this chap. The Poles in the audience will have to forgive me. I got Maciej Szywowski. Is that close? Szywowski. One day I'll learn, yeah. Anyway, but he's written this really good piece. He keeps writing these really good talks. This year, there's an uncomfortable feeling in the tech industry, this is a few years ago, a couple of years ago, that we did something wrong, that in following our credo of move fast and break things, some of what we knocked down were the load-bearing walls of democracy. Yeah, maybe so.
Yeah. Now you might say, oh, chemistry. It's a completely different field to tech. Nothing similar at all. Except for, so some people are starting to get a little bit nervous. This is Kumail Nanjiani. He is an actor in the TV series Silicon Valley, which everybody's always telling me I must watch because I'll love it. I haven't. But he made an observation about the kinds of things that he was seeing while he was researching for his role. And he said, often we'll see tech that is scary, altering video, tech that violates privacy, stuff with obvious ethical issues. We'll bring up our concerns to them. We are realizing that zero consideration seems to be given to the ethical implications of tech. They don't even have a rehearsed answer. This is a terrific article by Anna Lauren Hoffman on Medium, Data Violence, How Bad Engineering Choices Can Damage Society. And it opens with this quite sobering anecdote. A group of Harvard researchers unveil a system that automates the detection of gang crimes. This is dodgy for many reasons. Perhaps one of the biggest reasons it's dodgy is because the data on criminal activity in the US is extremely unreliable. A California state database of gang members at one point contained at least 42 babies. So when asked how this tool that detects gang crimes would be used, one of the project's computer scientists said, he confessed he didn't know, he said, "I'm just an engineer." Really? I'm just an engineer. And not wishing to bite the hand that feeds us, but we may bite quite a few hands during this talk, this was me trying to tag my proposal in the CFP for this very conference. It turns out you can't tag something as being about ethics. It's just impossible. In the end, I had to put it under machine learning. We'll talk about that later. People don't even seem to be thinking about ethics in the taxonomy for talks at conferences. And we can't get away from this. If we want to claim that software is art, or software is poetry, or engineering, or whatever you want to call it, then it has context. No software exists in a vacuum, and in today's world, we cannot afford to look this over. We need to understand the social and the ethical implications of the software we write, the software we design, the software we build, more than ever.
So in other disciplines, there are not only the sort of ethical codes, there are even ethical professionals. I mean, medical ethics is a full academic discipline with university departments and all the rest of it. That on the left is the Hippocratic Oath, which actually mostly turns out to be about loyalty to the guild and hardly ever mentions patients. But we know that medical ethics is a serious business these days. And most of us here, luckily, at least luckily for me, are not involved in cutting people up or prescribing restricted drugs. Although we were aware that there are large parts of the software industry that do safety critical systems, and they have their own rules. But this is mostly about the sort of generic business IT sort of world. There are codes of conduct. Most software and probably CS degrees have at least a module or a couple of lectures on ethics. We have, there we are. We have professional societies. This is the ACM, the IEEE, and the IEEE. They all have their codes of conduct, which, of course, we can all recite by heart. But there's an important difference between us and architecture, civil engineering, and medicine, and all the other stuff, which is, as far as I know, it is impossible to get struck off as a software developer. Nobody can stop you writing code. This is probably a good thing. Nobody can stop you putting that code that you've written into production somewhere. There's no test and there's no license. The state of the industry at the moment, that's probably a good thing. So we've got this dilemma is that we know we ought to do something, but the standard structures probably might not be the right way to approach it. So we sort of, this is inspired by a colleague of mine called Catherine Kirk, who's done a lot of stuff on she has a background in quite a strong background in Buddhism. And Buddhism is actually very pragmatic. It's very sort of earthbound, if you like, or grounded, I think is a better word. And in one formulation, there are these sort of three fundamental character flaws that keep people dissatisfied and stuck in the wrong part of the reincarnation cycle. You have, and there are these animals that represent them. So somewhere in here there's a pig, which represents ignorance, which is bewilderment, confusion, stupidity, and delusion. There's a cock, which represents attachment, greed, sensuality, desire, excitement, lust, and passion. Passionate programmers, that's where it goes. And then the snake, which is aversion or hatred. So this next section is a catalogue of sort of case studies or perhaps horror stories, which is a little bit depressing. The goal of this talk is to say perhaps we should think a bit more about building systems, and then we try and sort of cheer people up at the end. See, it's not that bad, really. In fact, one of the problems we have with this talk is that the examples from the real world keep popping up faster than we can paste them into the talk. There was 2 good ones in yesterday, I think, and it just keeps happening. And I bank for the TSB. Not much longer. Anyway, here we go. Ignorance. So this one is about quality and competence. And we shouldn't have to talk about this too much because all the software conferences are about, how to get stuff done properly. But there are plenty of examples to remind ourselves of the risk of hubris. So here's a few. How many people are familiar with the post office system and the story about that? There's a system that they built for managing branches, and it took a long time and a lot of lawyers to show that postmasters went to jail or ended up with massive debts and stuff because of flaws in the system for fraud they didn't commit. Knight Capital, function went into a bit of old code went into production and lost them, I forget, ever so much money, hundreds of millions in 45 minutes. And they shortly after that went out of business. I think 12 months. They were bought out by another company. I don't know if anyone's seen this one. New Zealand passports can't detect people of Asian descent. And this is a system that you need to renew your passport, except it obviously wasn't tested properly. So this is just, not quite getting it right. There are sometimes these are interesting. Some of these failures are to do with a change in context. So the Therac 25 is a famous, because there's a big case study about it. It's an X-ray machine that ended up massively overdosing patients. This is a big write-up I think this is the IEEE. And what happened was it went from a hardware lock to a software interlock, and they missed some of the detail on the way. And it wasn't until a technician managed, with a lot of effort, to reproduce the race condition that they could actually prove it. And a bunch of people died on that one. The other one on the left came up last year. A bunch of researchers at one of the American universities managed to hack a Jeep Cherokee and drive it over the internet. So you'd be driving along in your Jeep Cherokee, a hacked Jeep Cherokee, and someone could operate the brakes on you or turn off the steering wheel or all sorts of things, which is a little bit scary. And in that case, it turned out that because modern cars are basically networks, but the network protocol they used was not designed to be it's designed to be a closed network. And then you attach it to the internet and everything, and Jeep has since closed that loophole. So one of the lessons here is that bad software ruins people's lives, and we shouldn't forget that. It's easy to get carried away with ambition, or that neat idea. And this is mostly the realm of unintended consequences. Beginning with, wouldn't it be cool if? Got one of those? Wouldn't it be cool if? Some of it is us, some of it is marketing. Some things just need thinking through a bit more carefully. I mean, IoT is just this enormous... has anyone seen the headlines the other day about day before, about voice recognition? People hacking voice recognition with inaudible signals. Anyway, so here's one from a little while ago. Let's have a teddy bear that sends messages over the internet, that sends voice messages over the internet. Which is why the Germans, many of whom are the people in charge who actually grew up with a full-on police state, where kids were encouraged to inform on their parents, are not very keen on this kind of thing. Other countries are not quite as careful about some of this. Can your child agree to the 14 pages of terms and conditions? Or do you even understand the 14 pages of terms and conditions? And again, one of the common mantras about that the whole startup world is we're going to change the world and make everything, disrupt the old economy. And what we tend to forget is some of the things in the old economy were there for a reason. And we need to understand some of the things we give up when we break the world. So it's taken a long time to get to the point where discriminating against people on basis of all sorts of things is officially, legally a bad idea. And then you put Airbnb up. How do you enforce that? You're officially inviting people to come and stay in your house, so you need to give them some control over, some say over who turns up in your house, but, it's a bit difficult. And then Uber. It turns out the real thing is that Uber gets all these, again, with all the delivery and sort of effect, you get into some interesting, breaking some important regulations, like adequate checking of drivers, and using greyball to fool the regulators. There's a building, so I live in Westminster, and there's a building on Baker Street, which apparently before Christmas, I think was getting 100 deliveries an hour from all the people ordering online, and it's just bonkers. But no individual is responsible for that because you get this cumulative effect.
Okay, so you might say, okay, these kind of hot-headed startup types, they're convinced they're just disrupting the world, they're going to change the economy. And you might say, oh, that's not us. We're just doing X. So maybe the thing you're just doing is peer-to-peer payments. Okay, anything that involves communication between humans will almost certainly at some point become a vector for harassment. This is Square Cash, and you might think, why would you want to block someone sending you money? Except here's a story from Anne-Marie Clifton saying her friend's abusive ex had been sending her $1 on Square Cash regularly for months because he can add a message and she can't block that. In fact, this is quite a nice example. I mean, obviously it's a horrendous thing to start with, but the guy who responded to her, Robert Anderson, he works for Square Cash, and I think they did fix this quite quickly in the end. But it's an interesting thing. Anyone who's had an abusive ex could have told you about this potential risk, or known someone with an abusive ex. Anyone who's been followed home by someone who just won't leave them alone and won't take no for an answer. I'm willing to bet that based on what the women around me in my life have told me, that's a good proportion of the women here. And now, let's talk about Grindr. One laugh, thank you. So, show of hands, who here is going to admit to knowing what Grindr is? Okay. It's not quite as much as... I asked this question in Berlin and literally everyone put their hand up. Also, I should just say, first time I gave this talk, I hurriedly pasted these images in from the press website, and I didn't realize that the demo profile was for a white 20-something guy called Jonathan. And people asked, is this my Grindr profile? And I said, absolutely not. How dare you? How dare you assume that I would claim to work in marketing? So, Grindr. For the few people who don't know, Grindr is an app you can have on your phone if you are a man who would like to meet other men for officially, I think it's chats and dates and fun, in inverted commas. And you can use it to send pictures of quite rude parts of yourself to other people. Now, it's supposed to be a space for a minority community. Except it turns out there are flaws in Grindr that expose your location data. It's quite easy to triangulate people's exact location. It doesn't do very good location fuzzing. A lot of its logic's on the client side, or is or was. So if you install a root certificate and sniff their JSON API, excuse me, if you install a certificate, sniff their JSON API, you can see who blocked you and where they are. You can also, it turns out it's also sharing HIV status and various other personal data with advertisers. Now, why is this a bad thing? The community Grindr serves is not just a minority community. In many cases, LGBT people are hunted down and killed. There is always a tension between safety and convenience for commercial success. It's like any security problem. But we need to ask ourselves, is it okay to claim to offer a safe space targeted at LGBT people while providing a massive attack vector for people who want them dead or want to arrest them? And by the way, if we think this is something we don't have to worry about in our tolerant, liberal Western country, this is over the last few years in London. It does not take much effort to find examples of homophobic, transphobic, racist attacks in large cities all over the Western world. And this is the kind of stuff that personally keeps me awake at night. It's the reality of being in a minority group or a group that's oppressed. People will hate you for no reason other than you're different, or they want power over you. Can you imagine what that's like? Really? Because if I'm out on the street with my boyfriend, I have to look down the street. I have to look behind me before I hold his hand in public. Think about it. Would you use your app? Would you have made that security trade-off if you had to use your app and you were in a group where you knew that people wanted to kill you just because you existed? Consider this. Some researchers at Stanford developed an algorithm which the press claimed could detect from a person's dating profile, from the picture on their dating profile, if they were homosexual or heterosexual with around 80% accuracy. Now, in kind of a classic thing for the tech industry, it only works if you're white and if you're cisgender. Cisgender, by the way, meaning the gender you identify as now, is congruent with the sex you were assumed to be at birth. Now, this, by the way, has now been shown to be bunk. All it was doing was checking pre-existing stereotypes about whether gay men were more likely to be clean-shaven, lesbian women were more likely to wear glasses or not wear makeup in their dating profile pictures. But does this thing even need to be accurate or correct for the kind of people who'd want to use it to use it? Did anyone learn about witch hunts in school? Anyone? Now, the fact that the methods for finding out whether whether women were witches was bunk, i.e., making them float or whatever, or if you weigh them according to a duck, if you look at the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, the fact that the methods for finding witches was bunk did not stop the fact that people used them and used them to justify murdering women by the hundred. Now, big data, machine learning, I told you we'd get onto that. Big data is just a product of human activity, and it is implicitly subject to many of the same biases as human behavior, because ultimately it's just an algorithm that takes in data from humans. There is a real danger that we assume that because it's computers, that it's objective. Just because it's gone through a software program, it's objective. Not if all the software program takes in is human opinion. It's a function. Garbage in, garbage out. And you end up with quite nasty things such as this. And with that dealt with, Steve would like to talk to you about blockchains. Get your popcorn ready, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. So yes, once you've been around this, once you've been a certain age in this business, you've seen several bubbles. So we've got classic things: Kodak pivot to blockchain, shares go up. Iced tea maker pivots to blockchain, shares go up. They just announced it; they didn't actually do anything about it. Fashion TV has a blockchain currency. What? And even better, this Ethereum has explicitly stated that it's completely useless, and they still sold. I'm in the wrong business. But there's another side to this, which is, of course, the whole point about Bitcoin, the thing that makes it work, is it's expensive to calculate it's too expensive to get to calculate the next step in the chain, which means lots and lots of energy. And in a world where we're desperately trying to get energy uses down and be a bit more efficient, that's not necessarily a good direction to go in. And particularly when you've got the whole sort of mining. Now we have Bitcoin blockchain GIFs, sort of spinning your machine while you're not looking. It doesn't seem right. Another quote. Approaching the world as a software problem is a category error that's led us into some terrible habits of mind. I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that there are this cluster of hardcore libertarians in Silicon Valley. I don't know whether these guys are actually Dutch, I think. How about this blockchain? Now, it turns out that the company behind this, which is called Legal Things, is actually a rather boring blockchain company that's doing signing contracts between established companies. So I kind of suspect this is really just a publicity stunt. But you have to sort of look at it for a minute and think about whether this could be true. Anyway. Yeah.
I just want to go back to this for a moment. I just think this is like a perfect example of something, trying to engineer something. I mean, if it is a publicity stunt, yeah, but, Jake is requesting sexual consent. And by the way, make a statement about your sex life on a public ledger. Can people not see how that's slightly... Okay. So, if we go round the wheel again to the snake, to aversion, otherwise known as hatred. Some people do consciously bad things, but interestingly, most people do not believe they are bad people. This is a very interesting thing because very few people genuinely believe that they are bad people or they are doing bad things. They may believe they are doing bad things to effect a greater good, but they generally do not believe they are bad people. Now, large companies, as most of us know, do not necessarily want to look after your interests. This does not mean that Apple, that Google, that Uber, and so on are full of bad people, but something happens. Somehow people allow bad things to happen, or they're complicit in them. And some places do appear to be toxic. Uber are now desperately trying to show that they have changed. Now they've got their new CEO in from Expedia. And then we come to things like this. The trigger for me writing the original version of this talk was at the end of 2016, when I thought, frankly, what the fuck? I thought we were getting flying cars, and instead, what have we done? It looks like the richest of the rich have thrown significant amounts of money at mining people's Facebook data in a completely opaque way, often in, one would argue, quite a deceptive way through those quizzes that fed the Cambridge Analytica stuff. And that data has then been used to influence public opinion. The problem with this kind of innovation is it is impossible to, this kind of innovation, I should say in scare quotes really, is that it's impossible to see that people are behaving according to the rules. We can't see who's bankrolling politicians, who's bankrolling that public information campaign, what their motives might be. But I'm sure that Robert Mercer thinks he's saving the world. Something interesting happened when the Cambridge Analytica stories started breaking earlier this year, and it's a pattern seen by Maya Cates in her ethics classes, which she wrote about on Twitter. I'm in one of those CS ethics classes you all are saying should always exist, and wow, do I find myself about to go off all the other students every time they attend. There's a lot of, well, users should be technically competent enough to protect themselves. Well, they should read the EULA. Who actually reads the EULA? Anyone? I can see Jay Rosenbaum in the front just going, Sometimes. Yes, sometimes. I don't think anyone can hand on heart say that they have actually read every single word and kept abreast of all the changes of every single EULA they have ever agreed to. And this is a common thread, often from people who work for Facebook. This is Facebook Messenger when it broke earlier this year that it was lifting contacts out of people's phones and putting them on a kind of graph so they could do analysis. What about this scenario? Did they really agree to it? Even if you make the claim that the users of Facebook Messenger knew what they were agreeing to when they just downloaded the app and said, agree, 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 allow, 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 did their contacts agree? Did Facebook seek consent from everyone in every phone book? No. Think about it. This is a normal user story. As an X, I want Y so that Z. As someone, I want to do something so that I can achieve this other thing. What about people who aren't users of our system but are still affected by it? What about society as a whole? On the periphery of our systems, as we weave software more and more into our everyday life, maybe we should start thinking about that a bit more. Okay, and this is where it gets really dark. So this, we gave this talk in Berlin. This is the Holocaust Memorial. It's actually a scary thought that we're getting close to the end of living memory for the Holocaust. 17 million people killed, probably. It's a bit vague, but this was definitely before everything went digital. And we had better tools. I don't know if you've ever seen this. There was a physicist called Jacob Bronowski who did this fantastic series on the BBC back in the early days of BBC Two called The Ascent of Man. It was a period piece. And he did an episode where he went to Auschwitz. And this is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. That was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. Here's how you turn people into numbers. This is the Deutsche Hollerith machine, Hollerith cards. And they did the German company that provided the punch machine cards, for the sorting and all the rest of it, to store the information from the 1933 and 1939 German censuses and sort them and tabulate them and do what you'd expect. DHMAG was a subsidiary of a foreign company, an American company, otherwise known as IBM.
They had direct line of, in fact, they bumped up the investment because there seemed to be a lot of, bit of cash to be made. They also got involved IBM also got involved in the internment of Japanese citizens in the USA. So, it helps to have the machinery to do. You don't need it, but it certainly helps to have the right machinery.
Okay. So, I maintain that one of the worst things that our culture has done over the last 73 years is paint the Nazis as moustache-twirling villains who all simply disappeared on VE Day in 1945. That wasn't how it was. The Nazis, in the main, genuinely believed they were defending their ethnic heritage, that they were reducing a burden on the German state, that they were saving the world. And the question now is, I think, what if someone wanted to do that today? Where could they get their data from if they wanted to target some arbitrary group or some arbitrary people? How could they target people? Remember, they don't have to be government actors, but if it was, is that so far-fetched anymore, given the result of recent political developments? Our own government in the United Kingdom has a policy of a hostile environment for illegal migrants. Around the world, demagogues are gaining power by whipping up hatred. Donald Trump said he would ban Muslims from entering the United States. Just under a quarter of the world's population who follow one particular variation of a monotheistic Abrahamic religion. David Lewis is a reporter. He snuck into a neo-Nazi convention in Seattle, Washington, and this is a shocking observation. According to my observations, the standard Seattle Nazi is a white male, under 30, who either works in the tech industry or is going to school to work in the tech industry. You're also a coder? Do you mind if I send you something I've been working on? I heard that more than once. Something is really, really wrong in our industry. And I just want to return to this Bronowski quote briefly. Arrogance, dogma, ignorance. Remind you of anything?
So let's just take a little breather now.
It does get very dark, so...
Yeah. So let's having completely depressed everyone, let's see if we can pick this up again. What can we do? So unless, there's some people have the stamina or whatever, the drive to become a full-time activist. Most of the rest of us haven't, not quite that. Your options, on the whole, our options as individuals are limited. So you have to look at what you do have control over, and of course that depends on your circumstances and, whether you've got kids to look after and the mortgage and all the rest of it. But if we go back to the three poisons, the Buddhist poisons, the Buddhists identify three behaviors as antidotes to each of these poisons, which tends to be the opposite. So ignorance countered by non-ignorance or non-delusion. I think we can do a lot more to be non-delusional about what we do. We're in an industry that can just about cope with off-by-one errors on a good day. What makes us think we can run the world? I mean, I hope most of us have seen the things that the list of falsehoods about names that everyone believes. There's a long list of about 36 different things that are not true about names. And we need to spend a bit more time learning about the world outside that latest framework. Lest we forget our recent Home Secretary. So the tech industry gets all up in arms. Home Secretary wants to ban maths, all this kind of stuff. This is pretty uninformed. Well, and we should be free to provide unencryptable, unbreakable encryption if that's, because that's the right thing. Okay, I can see that. Now, let's imagine we're an encryption specialist back in the 30s again. There's a certain theme to this. And we build a machine for businesses to communicate privately. Here's one. It's an Enigma machine. This is actually, I took this at a workshop that I ran with a colleague of mine at Bletchley Park as a test-driven workshop. And we did a little exercise. And one of the curators, when the curator brought this out, and all these geeks sort of went kind of a bit weak at the knees, and queued up to have their picture taken with the cool technology. Now, then you sort of step back to think, well, if this had worked just a little better, things might have turned out differently. We might not be sitting in this, well, for the moment, for another 8 months, prosperous liberal country. But it turns out that the German cryptographers knew that the enigma could be broken, theoretically. They just didn't believe it was practical. So clearly, encryption is a really bad thing, and is too dangerous to allow out. But then here, it's cryptography being used to aid millions of people to improve their lives, and the whole world is available to people with not much access because cryptography reduces transaction costs. So guess what? No easy answers. But and most of us live in a comfortable but a fairly closed world. And I think it's interesting for us sitting here is that looking at the possible growth areas for IT, in particular, there's a lot happening in Africa where they have, and for good reason, a very different attitude to certain kinds of innovation. I saw a really good talk a couple of years ago at QCon from this woman from Nigeria, I think, saying that where she grew up, there are villages where the language changes at midday. They change from one dialect to another dialect at midday. That's not the sort of thing we're used to.
Okay.
Non-attachment.
Let's talk about non-attachment. So, if I say the name Robert Metcalfe, does that ring any bells? No? Are you all really asleep? Okay.
I am.
Yeah. I'm actually sleepwalking while I'm presenting this right now.
Yes.
So, Robert Metcalfe, Bob Metcalfe, founder or father of Ethernet, he is also famous for this, Metcalfe's law. The value of a telecommunications network is proportional to the square of the number of connected users of the system, or n squared. So that means many of us work in winner-takes-it-all domains, which naturally converge to a small number of dominant players. So the rewards for being part of a unicorn startup, the author of that one true framework, are so high that it kind of distorts what we as an industry think is admirable. As always, the danger is shiny objects and shiny object syndrome. We can kind of get a tunnel vision when we're just leaping for the next shiny. And we are as vulnerable as any technical industry to doing stuff just because we can. We can make a point of stepping back from time to time to understand the effects of what we do, and we can prioritize things other than packing our projects with the latest resume buzz. So pCalc is a popular calculator app for iOS. It's developed by an independent developer called James Thompson. He has been developing it in some form or another for, I think, basically 30 years now, back to the days of the original Macintosh. So he wanted, it offers a feature on iPhone where you can pick an alternate app icon. So you can change it to a kind of gunmetal effect or a kind of gold-plated effect. Maybe if you're Donald Trump, you'll really like that. Or to kind of more retro things. Or you can change it to some other things. Now, James Thompson, the developer, wanted to put in some telemetry so you could see which alternate icons were the most popular. But he realized something. You may have noticed that is a gay pride flag there, and behind that dialog box there's also a bisexual pride flag and a trans pride flag. And he realized, he thought it would be fun to show which alt icon people had picked to find out which was the most popular, but I realized if they'd chosen one of the pride icons, that would be sensitive personal information. So I didn't do anything. He decided he wasn't going to do it, just not collect that data. This is a really good example, I think, because it's not often enough in our business that not doing something is considered an acceptable answer. I mean, we always talk about maximizing the amount of work not done, but when do we actually talk about just not doing something at all? Jen Schiffer is a developer. She has a sideline in writing front-end dev satire. So she's written articles such as How Node.js is Going to Replace JavaScript. Think about it. So she gave a great talk in 2016 at XOXO in Portland, Oregon, and she made a very, very pertinent point. It's getting harder and harder to write satire. When things in real life that sound like satire start to happen, it's way past the time when we need to start reflecting on how we are fostering a society built on hate. We cannot let people advance tech for their own selfish reasons while they pretend they're doing it for everyone. Satire is becoming increasingly indistinguishable from reality. Case in point from Jen's talk, A startup which offers $8,000 for you as an older person to replace your blood with the blood of younger people to delay the aging process. $8,000 a pop. It sounds like satire, but it isn't. Peter Thiel is reported to have invested in this. Peter Thiel of PayPal fame. As Jen Schiffer said immediately afterwards, we can't all have access to young people's blood. Non-attachment can really be summed up like this. It's just like commuting to work by speedboat or most staging ideas at the Eurovision Song Contest. Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should.
Actually, I'm reminded by if those of you remember Lily Tomlin, she was a comedian from, I saw her in the 90s, and she had this great line at the end of the show, which is, no matter how cynical I am, I still can't keep up with the world. Anyway, so non-hatred. This is a shorter version of, the short version of this is not to let them pull you into your world, into their world. Not least of which there's more of them than there are of you, so you'll lose. This is a really nice example. Came a little while ago. Mary Beard, famous TV academic. And it's a very rare story, and it isn't a strategy to recommend to everybody, but so some plonker on the web called her a slut, and I thought, and she managed to trace the guy down, and she threatened to tell his mum. In the end, after some chatting and stuff, and they sort of broke the ice, and they became friendly, and she ended up writing a reference for him. It is extremely rare, but very occasionally possible. It turns out that shouting each other over the internet achieves very little. There's a couple of other examples which I haven't put up pictures for. One is that there's a law graduate called Femi Sorry, well, his Twitter tag is Femi Sorry, who's going around trying to deprogram Brexiteers, if you like. And then there's another one, there's a chap in America, African-American, who goes around deprogramming members of the Klan. And apparently he's had couple of hundred so far, which is quite a remarkable story. So it turns out one of the rules is just be civil to people. It's not a very high standard. If it turns out it's and partly it's just not being that nasty person in the first place. And it's kind of caught on. Things actually have improved. We now have codes of conduct. This is the local one. Most conferences do this nowadays. This didn't exist even a few years ago. So, there is hope. Collective action, campaigning, visibility, all has an effect. And it's a rough ride sometimes getting there. And you have sort of codes of conduct for people in the industry. This is, again, when there was all the talk about banning all the Muslims. This is a group that started up, it's like a pledge from US IT workers not to work on a registry of religious beliefs that could be used for detaining people. So, one of the options, if you're in the right situation, if you have ethical concerns and no one's listening or no one cares, or people are happy to sign off on something you think is dangerous, most of us, or many of us, are in a position where we can actually choose to leave. That's not true for a lot of people. And again, this is our last quote. The one effective lever we have against tech companies, is employee pressure. We have seen some of this bubbling up in Facebook and maybe a little bit in Google. Unfortunately, the enemy is complacency. A workplace free of politics is just one of the many perks the tech industry offers its pampered employees. What I think this says is maybe we can't get away with this. Sometimes we do have to have those difficult conversations. And this one came up yesterday, actually, or the day before. This is Mike Hill, who's an agile, one of the early agile coaches, who likes to be dramatic. Seize the moment, make sure you can sleep at night, and then seize it. We do, in fact, have the power just now to change the world. It would be a shame if we bought into it instead. And here's another one. So there is movement. This is what was it? Center for Humane Technology, institute set up in Silicon Valley somewhere. So we're beginning to see a bit of a response to some of the stuff that's been going on. Their strapline is realigning technology with humanity's best interests.
So, we now kind of arrive at a question. Should we... oh, excuse me. I'll just cough my lungs up first. I apologize. So, we now kind of arrive at the real question, which is kind of the crux of what we kind of want to say through all this thing. Should we, as developers, clearly we do have some kind of power, but should we use our position to resist handing control to a few dominant players? Control of the industry, control of the world, control of society. But we might ask, who do we think we are to make this call? You might say, I'm just an engineer. But the real question is, who else is there? Who else is there to make that call? It's complicated. There is no right or wrong answer, but at a very minimum, we can try to decide what we think is right. We can at least make a decision, and then we can act upon that decision. We can try to avoid deluding ourselves that we're doing a great job when we're just accounting for a small subset of the population. We can be humble. We can make sure it's acceptable and even expected to talk about your concerns and say, can this go wrong? Is this a good idea? And we can make sure we have a life outside tech. We need to learn about life outside our bubble, learn about other people, their experiences. Understand that just by being here, you are probably in a privileged position that people affected by your system will not necessarily be in. We can try to avoid getting too attached. We can do our best to make sure we keep our eyes on the prize. We can make sure we try not to get seduced by shiny object syndrome, by that framework, that technology, that potential entry on your LinkedIn profile, if people still use LinkedIn these days. We can consider how bad actors might want to use our system. It's just like any security problem. If you were in Siren, Hoff, and Johanna's talk yesterday, Security Loves Dev, it's really great. Go and see it when it goes on YouTube. We can try and model it like any security threats. Imagine someone wants your users dead, or you dead, or some third party dead. And think not just about attackers who want to break your system, but people who want to break your other users. And when it comes to hatred, we can have a visible ethical charter, codes of conduct, and we can back it up. Having a code of conduct for a conference is great, but it may as well just not exist if it's not actually enforced. We can refuse to undertake something we consider to be immoral, and if our refusal is refused, we, at least in most cases, can leave. And we can set a minimum standard of being civil to people, of not being an arsehole. We can just try to be kind. In the end, everyone has to find their own balance. Most of us are not going to be monks. Most of us are not going to be full-time priests or activists. Most of us are probably going to be in software for a considerable time in our lives. So perhaps one option is to accumulate as much power as possible and resources, just keep climbing the ladder with a chain of startups. So you can accrue as much wealth and as power as possible and have more influence in the world, and then become a philanthropist and launch that foundation or run for president. Maybe it's best to just be a jobbing programmer, to make a living and get by, spend your emotional effort on other things. Or maybe something else. Fine, I'm not here to judge you. I'm not here to make that decision for you. But I urge you, I beseech you, make a conscious decision and don't drift into a world that you didn't choose. Thank you. We do have around a minute if anyone wants to give us questions or scream at us and say, well, actually, you're wrong. Okay.
Sorry.
That person over there first. The question was, is there a way to determine which companies are ethical and which companies are not? I'm not sure. The what, sorry? The Java champion stuff. That's a good question. So the question was, is there like a Java Champions style thing, like a mark of accreditation, I think, for ethical tech companies? And correct me if I'm wrong. Now, I'm not sure if there is. Maybe there should be, but I genuinely don't know. There are some initiatives starting to turn up, but I think mostly at the moment they're kind of individuals devoting their time rather than companies signing up en masse to say we will live by this charter.
It's a bit tricky because what counts as ethical kind of depends on what you believe, which is one of our points. I think the only thing you can do is check what they say publicly, and then if you go talk to them, check what they say privately. People have different edge points as to where they. I mean, gambling is one of those transition ones where some people think it's okay and some people don't.
Okay.
I
see Ruth in the front row.
Sorry, yeah.
So I have a question. I used to work for a large company that their revenue was coming mostly from mobile applications. So for one, before you post your app into, let's say, Apple Store,
Yeah.
they have a whole list of criteria you need to pass before your app gets approved. Are there agencies that can work for either Google Store or Apple Store to make a checklist? If a company or a startup out there is going to submit their application for the masses to use, what you guys have presented, there's a whole bunch of security issues out there that we as consumers are going to be using that apps not knowing, somebody can target us and our lives are in jeopardy, whether you're a woman or your race or your sexual orientation. There's different things that in that case can find a problem in who you are and target that, and your life is in danger.
So I think
The short summary is before you submit to the App Store or platform of your choice, are there people who can check what you're doing to make sure it's safe?
Like, are there agencies out there helping with this?
I'm sure someone's selling it.
I feel like they might exist. It's not something I've looked into because I know if you're writing fiction or if you're writing say or if you're building a game or something, then there are services. People can offer their services doing sensitivity reading. I don't know if that exists for software because, I mean, certainly my experience is that I'm quite careful about software I use and how it could be used against me. I don't know if that applies to other people here, but I feel like maybe that's something that should exist. I mean, maybe it's something that even should be indicated on the App Store page, such as this app requires you to give away your email address and it could be used to look for your phone number or something.
I feel confident the fact that you thought of it means there's a startup somewhere.
And if it's not, then you can have it.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.